Hello, everybody. My name is Paul Ransbury, and it's just a real honor to be here today to have such a wonderful group of experts together to talk about a really important topic, which is the importance of expert UPRT instructors. Today, we're going to be transmitting and broadcasting live on 4 different channels. We're going to be on LinkedIn, YouTube, Facebook, and Twitter, and we'll be primarily monitoring LinkedIn. So if there's a question you want to ask, just pop over there to post it in, but we'll be trying to watch all the different channels at the same time. We do have Carrie Bryson with us. She'll be in the chat channel or comment channel in LinkedIn. So if you're asking a question, watch for her to respond if I can't get to it. And she's going to be helping out to make sure you get the information that you need today. And right at the beginning, once we go to the introductions, I'll post a link in case you have any questions at all or need more information from the event today, that you can reach out to us, and we're happy to connect with you offline. If you do have any event questions, if you want to ask a question, just post it right into the comment stream. And again, we'll be primarily watching LinkedIn, but we'll most likely pick up something if you put it into YouTube or Facebook. So please just do your best to do that. Let's go ahead now and move on here to get going. And before we do, I just want to put a plug in for our all new facilities at our headquarters in Arizona. Any of the pilots on board here today watching, you have a standing invitation to come and see us. If you're at the KIWA Phoenix Mesa Gateway Airport area in Arizona, please drop in. We'd be happy to show you around for a tour. For today's topic, the importance of expert UPRT instructors, and it really falls in line with APS purposes of we help pilots bring everyone home safely. And it really is such an important discussion as we start moving into really a new paradigm of overcoming the threat of loss of control in flight through upset prevention and recovery training. So what I'd like to do is we're just going to go ahead and start with some introductions here today. So we're going to get everybody coming on board. You're going to see the whole team, and we are going to have a chance to meet everybody, and we're going to go in alphabetical order. And Brad, we're going to start with you, and for a minute or less, just let everybody know who you guys are. Go ahead, Brad.
Yeah, hi, BJ, and everybody else on the team and everybody watching. It's great to be here today. I am currently flying an Airbus 320. My flying career started when I was 16 years old. I managed to get onto a Back 111 jet at the age of about 22, and from there I progressed on 7 Boeing 737s, and then joined South African Airways in 2000. During the course of my career from about the age of 24, which was about 3 years ago, no, just kidding, but from about 24, I started flying aerobatics and managed to purchase an aircraft. You can see one of them here behind me. As Lynn 50, started my own aerobatic team, got involved with aerobatic competition, and then managed, or fortunate enough, to keep a sponsor for about 20 years. Then I owned 2 extra 300s and flew around 600 air displays around the country, and then also some air displays on the Airbus 330, 340 and 320, which I was fortunate enough to do for South African Airways. In 2012, because of my experience, I was nominated by the chief pilot to take up the upset prevention recovery training program, which is when we attended the APS Train the Trainer program in Arizona. And from there, it's just been a steep learning curve all the way to now, where I'm still involved with upset prevention recovery training. I think I worked out, I've trained 25 instructors and carried out about 600 simulator sessions for South African Airways and other companies around the world.
Great. Thank you, Brad. All right. Wonderful. Over to you, Randy.
So my flying began in gliders when I was in high school. And when I went to the University of Colorado to study aerospace engineering, they had both a glider operation and an aerobatic school on the field. And so that allowed me to both progress in learning and in teaching in both of those areas. After I graduated, for some reason, flying sounded more fun than engineering, and I started flying air shows similar to what Brad did. I was with a couple of different civilian 4-ship formation aerobatic teams. But once I started having kids, it was time to be around home a little bit more, and I flew as a corporate pilot for about 9 years in a variety of turboprop and jet aircraft. And that combination of the all attitude experience and right side up experience was attractive to Eclipse Aviation, who was trying to put together an upset training program for their customers and company pilots. So I put that program together and trained the instructors and taught that for about 3 years in an L-39 Albatross out of Albuquerque, New Mexico, until that company had financial difficulties. And then that just coincidentally was about the time that a group called ICATI, that was a working group of the Royal Aeronautical Society, was established. And through that, I began working with Paul Ransbury and Clark McNeese for a period of about 3 years until they needed an instructor to come on board at APS. And that's been 9 years ago that I've been working with BJ and Otter. So, and it's just nice to be on board with all of my colleagues and friends.
Great. Thank you, Randy. Looks like we had a little bit of a problem on LinkedIn, but we're back up and transmitting now. So over to you, Mark.
Oh, good morning, everybody. Again, first I want to thank APS for inviting and having us here and having this important conversation. My background in association with this is I started in the civilian aviation world. Pretty much general aviation, a common track for my time. Embry-Riddle instructing, followed by 135, some Alaska flying, some corporate flying, and then ultimately regionals and United Airlines. With United Airlines, I've pretty much flown all the Boeings except for the 747, and had the opportunity to be an instructor for over a decade on the 777. During my time as the instructor, I was the QC lead. I also helped develop a number of programs, including human factors change review associated with the importance of standardization between two cultures. I was also involved in instructor development and LCA training, as well as finally, probably the most important project we did was the offset prevention recovery training, which I was integral in from basically inception to fruition. So I'm looking forward to this conversation because I do see both within United and within the industry as United expands out and other airlines expand out into training and looking at more ab initio style pilots, that we look at the importance of having exceptional instructors and ensuring that that standardization follows through from the beginning to the end, so we have an in-state product.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Mark. Otter, over to you.
Yeah, greetings, everyone, from Phoenix here. But I started flying when I was a kid, high school, college, got a number of ratings there, went to the Navy, flew fighters and instructed in the Navy as well. From there to the airlines, a major airline flying Boeings for 10 years before then really partnering with BJ, it's hard to believe, almost 17 years ago, to help develop the UPRT program for the APS. I remember one of my first upset training books was Rich Stoltz, Emergency Maneuver Training, and he was my hero. When I read that, I was just fascinated. Even with all my all-attitude maneuvering that I'd gotten in the Navy, I was like, man, this is good stuff. Really well written. So neat book. Highly recommend it. He's got a couple other good books. Another good book as well. But certainly almost 17 years ago began my full-time journey as a UPRT instructor, mainly in the aircraft, in the aerobatic airplane, but also learning how to integrate the simulator as well. I got called onto the FAA Stall Stick Pusher Working Group to help write Advisory Circular 120-109. Helped open our operation in the Netherlands, where I also got a chance to work with EASA in Cologne, Germany, when they were writing their UPRT regulations. So that was fascinating work as well. But it's certainly been a fun ride for me. It's something I'm definitely passionate about, and I tell you, I am truly honored to be with all of these experts here, because they truly are experts in this area.
Awesome. Thank you, Otter. Over to you, Brian.
Well, good morning, everybody. My name is Brian Sims. Work for Delta Airlines as an instructor pilot on the 757 and 767. My aviation career began overseas. I was born in Southeast Asia and grew up in bush aviation. So I grew up in tail draggers on grass strips, and that really is where my love of aviation lies, and probably will forever. but moved back to the U.S. when I was 18, attended Embry-Riddle, like Mark, I think you went there as well, and worked there as an instructor pilot for several years. From Embry-Riddle, moved on to the regional airlines, where I flew for 10 years on the CRJ 200, 700, 900. Spent 3 years there in the right seat, 7 years in the left seat, and then after that, had an opportunity to move on to Delta. Been working in the training department at Delta now for about 6 years. 5 of that has been focused on UPRT specifically, which is where my relationship with APS began. Delta started a contract with APS about 5 or 6 years ago, I guess it's been at this point. And so I had the opportunity to go through the Train the Trainer program in Texas, and then have attended the recurrent training out in Arizona on the Extra 300, as well as the Marchetti S211. For about the last 3 years within the UPRT world, I've been leading the team of subject matter experts at Delta for all the fleets. So I do fly the 7576, but then work with all of our SMEs on all of the different Airbus and Boeing aircraft that we fly, which is where I am today. So excited to be with you this morning.
Wonderful. Thanks, Brian. Rich?
Yes, good morning, everyone, from Meridian, Idaho. Sunny and smoky here today. I started developing the emergency maneuver training program in 1987, and I've spent my entire aviation career in general aviation, working with light airplane pilots in light airplanes. And the program came about really to bridge the gap between normal flight training and aerobatic training. And in some ways, I like to think that the EMT program was maybe a forerunner or forefather to what we're discussing today in terms of UPRT. And over the years, I've done 34,000 plus spins with trainees from all over the world. And I think the more important number is the ratio of spin entries to recoveries remains 1 to 1. I was also helped develop the Master Flight Instructor Aerobatic designation, which I believe all of the APS instructors are required to renew that designation every 2 years. And I congratulate them for really embracing that program and adopting it and going through it every 2 years with their instructors. I also co-authored with BJ and Randy in 2014 a paper addressing on airplane upset prevention and recovery training in response to the publication of the ICAO manual. And I believe, BJ, that's going to be available to everyone who's listening today. And I've actually worked with BJ and some of the folks at APS. I've known BJ I looked it up the other day, BJ. It's more than 20 years now.
Wow.
Before you were actually APS. And you guys have really burst onto the scene, and proud of what you've been doing and how you've made all of the inroads on the air carrier side of things. And on to the next person.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Rich. Over to you, Nick.
Well, thank you. And it's humbling, and I'm honored to be part of this group today with all the talent and the experience, some more than 20 years, but they don't look it. Anyway, I'm a retired naval aviator and a chance in the Navy to fly a lot of different aircraft, from rotary wing off of small ships in the North Atlantic to worldwide transport ops in multi-engine fixed wing. And also served in the Navy's Training Command as a primary and advanced instructor, where I taught our version there of, we called it OCF, out of control flight, the Navy's answer to UPRT. After retiring, I worked for flight safety with a contract for the government, training Army aviators, transitioning them into fixed wing aircraft, where I trained in the Cessna, their aerobatic airplane, the Zlin, and also the C-12. About 4 years ago, I went with APS, where I went out to Arizona to become a instructor with the intent of seasoning and bringing the program out here to Dothan, where we teach it now to the Army's aviators. So all the Army aviators on their way from helicopter to multi-engine receive upset prevention recovery training, as do their instructor pilot candidates. And we also give them a simulator session. And my work for the last 4 years has been maintaining and standardizing that program and training students and instructors.
Awesome. Great. Thank you so much, Nick. What we'll do now, and I just wanted to share that it looks like there was a problem on LinkedIn. The link has been reposted. It's still running well on Facebook, YouTube, and Twitter. So if for some reason we need to repost it in LinkedIn, we will do that. But it looks like everybody's made the conversion over. All right, let's go ahead and get started here to talk about an initial discussion topic or a hypothesis or a conundrum that we're facing in the regime of upset prevention and recovery training. There's really a couple different things going on. The first is we're seeing that upset prevention and recovery training is being presented in a couple vastly different ways. In one area, it's kind of what we were doing before under a new name. And on the other side of it, we can see there's an all new approach to implementing solutions to overcome the threat of loss of control in flight. So under the first category, we have instructors in an industry that is very used to the traditional unusual attitude installed training methods and applications. And one thing to note is that has established loss of control in flight as the #1 threat faced by every pilot on every flight. So the concern, of course, is taking what we used to do, relabeling it and calling it upset prevention and recovery training, will have very little to no impact, most likely, on the industry in overcoming this particular threat. The exciting part, though, is that back in 2014, we had the issue of the ICAO Doc 111, the Manual on Airplane Upset Prevention and Recovery Training, and really sets the stage for a potential paradigm shift in the industry. Unfortunately, it is possible, and we've seen that in Europe and in some other areas of implementing UPRT, it is possible to take what we were doing before and force it into what's being presented by ICAO. And again, the concern remains the same, that there's going to be issues in actually mitigating the threat. Instead of just trying to get something done because it's required, we want to make sure that we do it well to really overcome this really unnecessary cause of loss of life. Of course, when it comes to the ICAO manual and upset prevention and recovery training, there still remain gaps. It's never going to be perfect, but adopting things like the appropriate airplanes, use of all attitude airplanes, the proper intensity of training, and most germane to this topic today is truly having expert UPRT instructors to implement these solutions. And it's going to be a way forward in the future. Unfortunately, as we're seeing in Europe, that there's many providers now, because of being a commodity market and being required, is really being pushed down into the minimum time, the minimum solution, and being forced to use airplanes they have already instead of going to the platforms really needed to implement it in a comprehensive, effective way. So to get started, what I'll do is let's go to you, Brad, and just see, are you seeing this situation at all, or this hypothesis or conundrum in upset prevention and recovery training? Then we'll just kind of go through the channel here, and we'll just go in order if we can. Brad?
Absolutely, BJ. So, relabeling something and continuously practicing the old methodology, especially within airlines, we still see. But, the whole paradigm shift towards realizing that loss of control in flight can't just be a box-ticking exercise in terms of how the training department is going to handle it. So what we do find is that the majority of the problem is understanding this issue by the regulator and by the airlines and by the instructors themselves, who don't have a grasp of, firstly, how dangerous it is to have unqualified instructors teaching certain aspects of upset prevention recovery training. What we found is that the regulator themselves, or many regulators that we've chatted to, they don't have a grasp of what upset prevention recovery really entails. If we look at the old way of training, we're looking at sort of procedural type training. We're looking at what the OEMs are putting into their manuals, and then putting it into a training department to then almost train by rote learning, instead of gaining a better understanding of it and then being able to apply what you learned and correlate it properly in terms of how situations are going to unfold. So what we found in our training sections is that startle is a big thing that's omitted in terms of training. Once we understood exactly how startle affected pilots, and we understood that through about training 500 to 600 pilots, and then of course the recurrent training program, we could see that when you put a pilot under pressure, obviously the law of primacy kicks in and they'll always revert back to what they were taught before. But one has to have a fundamental understanding of the psychology of how a pilot behaves under stress, and then figure out a way to get that pilot to react, to remain functioning under this severe startle situation. And I think that's where the training has really metamorphosized from the old way of putting a guy in a level attitude, 5,000 feet above the ground, letting him recover from a stall or some form of mild, unusual attitude, and then claiming that that was a successful recovery and that the student had learned what is needed to apply in real life situation. What we're seeing with putting guys under pressure, and you can do that in many ways, and then putting an upset into the situation where their RAM that's available is already reduced, and now you put them into a situation where their cortex starts taking a lot of strain, the fight or flight mode starts kicking in, and they start their performance really degrades. Is something that every training section should consider, and then of course putting a strategy into place like the APS or attitude recovery strategy, and training that properly so that we can keep pilots functioning in situations of severe startle. So I think that's where we've moved from this rote type of training to what we're trying to achieve, which is a higher order of thinking and sort of an aviation decision-making process using a strategy to try and keep pilots functioning in situations of severe startle.
Awesome. Great, Brad. Over to you, Randy. Anything to add to that, or do you want to start on a new train of thought?
No, I'd like to emphasize what Brad pointed out about the lack of understanding. And it comes from two areas, and I think he explained the human factors aspect quite well, that I don't think that we are always treating the human factors aspect in training the way it's going to be met in the real world. But the other aspect of that is the aerodynamics. And the reason for that lack of understanding or appreciation is that the two ways that we train, typically in normal category aircraft or in the normal flight envelope or in simulators, in either of those cases, we aren't generally exposing pilots to all of the ramifications of a stall with side slip, as an example. And so often pilots are met with situations in actual upsets that they have never seen before in training. And so this paradigm, this blind spot, if you will, extends to a lot of those in industry and management or regulatory situations where they go, what is the problem? What is the big deal? They can't understand why loss of control in flight is the problem that it is or continues that way. And it's because they don't have the full view. Now, many of the people on our call today have all attitude experience. Some of them don't, but even those that come principally, from an airline background have done the on-aircraft training with APS so that we were able to illustrate to them those aerodynamic aspects that are missing in a simulator or in a normal category aircraft. And we think that that's important for a instructor, even if they're in a simulator, to really incorporate or appreciate the full ramifications of how things are different in an upset event.
Mark.
Absolutely. So I want to build on what both Randy and Brad have said, both in the human factors, but also in looking at the importance of having an expert instructor. Both when we were developing the program at United and then ultimately after looking at how it was implemented in the results, we saw that, number one, we couldn't have put together a good program without having the training and the expertise being ready to teach our instructors how to do it. But we also had to recognize that then those instructors had to be able to go out and maintain a level of expertise. So the only way we could do that was both a fundamental foundational training, so making sure you have a good training program. So that's key. And I'll get back to that when I talk a little bit about the civilian world outside the airlines. The second piece is making sure that when you train them, they're being trained by the experts and then ultimately being QC'd and followed up so you can see the results of your training and then feedback and make sure that the program is evolving. So that's within the airline. Now, what I'm disappointed to say is that as this progresses, there's creep, there's instructor drift, and we see that there's challenges to the program that if this is really, truly the biggest threat to aviation, then there should also be the investment behind it. So let's go just outside the airline and civilian side in training. The only way we're really going to get expert instructors to not only be required, but needed is, for me, it was PTS, of course, I'm showing my age, but now ACS standards, is instead of just saying upset or unusual attitudes, what we need to be able to speak to is be able to say, for example, demonstrate the ability to explain the importance of the push, right, in the ACS standards. And if you have a structure like that, then it requires the instructor and who's instructed them to be able to explain that and teach that in depth, as opposed to just say, recover from this, right? How do I recover from this? Being able to get a little deeper into the aerodynamics, a little bit deeper in the importance of the aspects of recovery. And I think that would be integral in the regulatory piece to make sure that that's done. And I do think there should be a certain level of requirement prior to reaching an airline that you have had this training, that it is an identifiable piece of training. We are getting to a point, and I'm sure Brian can speak to this as well, that we will have ab initio pilots. We will have lower time pilots coming into the flight deck. And the concern associated with that is air France, of course, or someone that gets in the seat that doesn't recognize the issues. So, next.
Right. Thank you very much, Mark. Otter.
You know, those are all great points, and I'll just add this because it may have slipped through. I don't know if everybody heard what BJ said back at the beginning, and that is that loss control and flight statistic, that column, the number one threat that we now have is largely there because of the way we currently train pilots and the way we have currently trained pilots for decades. And so I would just encourage any of you regulators out there, any of you flight training department managers, instructors, if you have any temptation to just repackage your UPRT using standard run-of-the-mill stall training, unusual attitude training, we just want to encourage you to really rethink that, because there's been a lot of industry effort that over recent years that where industry stakeholders from all around the world have agreed that we can't do that. We've got to have a paradigm shift in the way we approach loss control of flight, and UPRT is the mitigation, and it has to be done correctly, and the instructor is the key. Everybody's agreed that the instructor is the key, and we can't just pass him a couple of pieces of paper with some terminology on it and some suggested scenarios and say, hey, you're qualified now to teach UPRT. That would be a grave injustice, very risky to do, and all that. So we need to make a difference. The instructor is key, and it's got to have that paradigm shift.
Great. Thank you, Otter. Brian.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I feel like each one of the things that's been said, I could go for 10 minutes on one of those points, but I'll draw back to something, a comment that Brad made about the levels of learning. And Rich, you may appreciate this as a master CFI, but I was having a conversation last week with one of our senior line check airmen, and I said, you know, now 20 years into instructing, having taught thousands of airline pilots myself, I still go back to the fundamentals of instructing and the levels of learning that I got when I got my initial CFI. And that is rote, understanding, application, and correlation. And every single one of those pieces is absolutely essential to the process. You know, rote, we have the strategy, push, roll, power, stabilize. We want that ingrained to the point where I wake you up in the middle of the night and I say positive rate. Every Delta pilot would respond gear up. They don't know where they are and they don't know what they're doing, but if you say positive rate, they're going to say gear up. And so if I say upset recover, I want you to respond with push, roll, power, stabilize. Moving on from that, the academic piece is, I don't want to overstate one of the four levels, but in my mind, that may be the most important of all the levels, because if you don't understand what it is that's happening aerodynamically on the aircraft, it can be very difficult to understand how to fix that problem. We fix it with the rote, we fix it with the application and the correlation, but you must understand the academics, and that really is where APS comes in. Even for a major airline like Delta or United or any of the others who send their instructor pilots out there, we don't know what we don't know, and we spend 99% of our life straight and level 1G right side up. And when you take that and you reorient that, it all changes. And as you all know, and as many of you watching may know, when you start listening to someone who spends 99% of their time right side up at 1G trying to explain what happens when you turn that airplane upside down, you get some pretty interesting responses. And the last thing I will touch on is the application step in the simulator. It's where we train it. But then the correlation step is where we've begun to see the benefit at Delta Airlines, because as we look at the ASAP data and we look at the FOQA data, yes, our numbers have dropped, but we still do have events. You're not going to have a perfect flight. You can't 100% remove error and threat from the operation. And so where we have seen the correlation is when we do have an event that the ASAP report says and the FOQA data confirms that the pilots executed the upset recovery strategy to recover that jet to the normal envelope, or to more quickly keep that jet from exceeding the normal envelope if and when those events happen. So hats off to you all for participating in that process and helping make us safer.
Great. Thank you, Brian. Rich.
Yeah, Brian, thanks for mentioning the levels of learning. And unfortunately, a lot of instructors understand that there are 4 levels, but they can't actually fill in those boxes. Say, for example, what do the levels of learning look like in relationship to stalls? What do they look like in relationship to roll recovery or any other aspect, right? So we just talk broadly in those terms, but we don't really fill in the blanks for specific situations. The other thing you mentioned, Brian, that is particularly key is that we as experts, as trainers, as instructors, always need to be lifelong learners, right? Whether it's going back to review the basics, to refortify maybe areas that we've forgotten about, or stretching our own boundaries as well. And talk about the conundrum, of course, on the light airplane side. As soon as a new 4-letter word comes out like UPRT, of course, you have all of the providers in the aerobatic community saying, hey, okay, let's adopt that label. We do that too. They adopt the label, but not the framework, which is unfortunate. And really the 3-part framework of academics, simulation, which could be as effective as, or something as simple as imagery or visualization, and then the in-airplane part of it. So what we see is basically putting lipstick on a pig, right? So without really going that extra mile with it. And this isn't to say that's true with all of the aerobatic operators. We would think that aerobatic instructors would be a natural fit as UPRT instructors, but it is a different mindset and does require a different skill set. We are not trying to do maneuvers perfectly. We are trying to put the trainees in situations that are more stressful and botching maneuvers and having them recover. So from that standpoint, I think there are opportunities maybe to educate those who might be a natural fit already as UPRT instructors. But at the same time, we also have the issue where if a trainee already shows up to a UPRT training provider, having misconceptions already, then we're trying to have to retrain. And as we all know, what we first learn, we learn worst, right? So it's really hard to break those initial habits. So the second prong of this is to get even non-UPRT instructors on the same page, using the same terminology and language, and bolstering their academic understanding right from the start. So I'll leave it at that.
That's wonderful. Thanks, Rich. In fact, what I'm going to do is I'm going to ask Carrie to post up the document that Rich had talked about earlier. It's called Addressing on Airplane UPRT, and really addresses some of the concepts that Rich was just talking about. But it's a great resource that's additive to the ICAO manual on upset prevention and recovery training. And Rich, I think you make a good point, is the other conundrum is just not doing what we used to do before. But to your point, people taking aerobatics and sticking UPRT on it, and they couldn't be more different. One is planned, one is unplanned. One's type specific, one is not type specific. One is intended to be transferable, the other one not necessarily so. So there's a tremendous difference. Okay, Outback, Nick, over to you.
Well, all great points that were made, and I think it just really focuses, what we should focus on is that you need that instructor expertise. And I think there's part of the reason for the pushback, because there is no shortage of talent in industry, in general aviation and commercial aviation, but there's a lack of expertise. We don't know what we don't know. And you can see when the AC 120, 111 came out, giving a guidance for the simulator UPRT for the airlines, major air carriers. They had 2 years to figure it out. And if you ask all the airlines, everyone believes that they had years and years of training experience, but everyone, 201, will tell you it was harder than they thought. They didn't have the depth to do it because we're teaching something new. Because remember, it hasn't been since 1949 that even spins were required for most pilots. So in a sense, a little bit of it's been legislated, but I think the other side is a business model. It's easy to count your assets in terms of aircraft. When you look at it, it's the instructors who leave at 4 o'clock. Those are the guys that really need to move the program along. And all great points, and that's all I'll add to that.
Awesome. Thank you so much there, Nick. All right, let's move on to the next slide, which is probably going to be the area where we spend the rest of our time. And it's really the topics related to expert UPRT instructors. And there's kind of 4 categories. In the description of the event, we had talked about prerequisite experience, qualification training, standardization principles. And then at the end, how do you know, A, you have a good instructor, B, you have a good program, and then C, that it actually works when it needed in a crisis in the real world. So what I'll do here is, why don't we just go ahead and get going through the process again. And tell you what, I'm going to leave this slide up to get things going. When it feels like we're on track, I'll get back to all the speakers, and you all can decide whether you want to do them one at a time, starting with prerequisite experience and chat to that, then move on. And then Randy, I'll hand you the reins and try to facilitate this discussion. But when it seems like we're on track, I'll go back to all the speakers again. So, Brad, why don't we start with you, and maybe just let's initiate on prerequisite experience, and then we can let it flow from there. Go ahead.
So, in 2012, after we visited APS and started putting the program together for our pilots, we had to look at who was going to be qualified as UPRT experts or instructors. And we did a little bit of an experiment where we took 4 instructors who had substantial aerobatic experience, who had flown in airshow competitions, who had flown air shows, who probably had about 1,000 hours of high performance aerobatics. And then we looked at 4 pilots who had never flown any aerobatics besides what was required for them to get their commercial pilot licenses, which was an approach to stall and possibly an incipient spin. What we did find, and I'll summarize it, is that overall the candidates, their background, what's the right word? Their enthusiasm and willingness to get involved in the project and to learn, because even the aerobatic guys, our top aerobatic pilots in South Africa, learned a hell of a lot by doing the UPRT course. You've touched on why UPRT is very different to aerobatic training. Obviously, the startle effect is the big difference there. But how do you actually put that startle effect into your training program so that you can create a pilot that's going to function under situations of severe stress? And what we found that the guys that were willing to put the time in and may not have had the experience like the other guys did, performed just as well in terms of being able to present the UPRT program. What we did find was that they did take a little bit longer to get to grips with some of the questions that I was throwing at them, some of the questions that the students might throw at them because of their lack of depth in terms of unusual attitudes. But we found that the guys, there was no difference at the end of the day between having somebody who had flown a tremendous amount of aerobatics to somebody who had never flown aerobatics before. And this was put together through an expert program through APS, who guided us and followed us through the whole program. So, the guys all went and did on-aircraft training, our pilots. That was a prerequisite. And when they got back from that, they already had the fundamentals, aerodynamic principles in place. They had experienced startle themselves. They felt that they had that physiological effects of brain fog under certain conditions that they could now relay to the students in the simulator. And then we put them through about 16 to 24 hours of simulator training so that they could get through the program in a 3 to 4 hour sim session. So prerequisite experience to us more really involves a candidate's willingness to participate in the program as an instructor.
Great. Randy, thoughts?
Well, certainly for the on-aircraft instructor, it's important that they have the all-attitude chops, the ability to recover from any of the situations that the student can put them in. And students can surprise you even after you've been doing it for a while. You'll wonder where they came up with that one. But for the simulator instructor, I've already referred to the importance of the on-aircraft component. But as Brad suggested, what we have seen is that the candidate's motivation is really a very, very important criteria for their success. At both United and at Delta in training their instructors, we saw militarily trained pilots right alongside civilian trained pilots. And I love it when they come together because they both see something that the other training programs, paradigms don't contain. The military pilot may say, "What do you mean you've never heard the term unload?" Well, it's not necessarily recognized by the FAA and some regulators in the context that it's provided to the military pilot, and the civilian pilot can explain to them their perspective when they've not gone beyond 60 degrees of bank. But the thing that burns through in either case is their motivation to absorb a large amount of information. I think it's surprising to them because even if they're existing, experienced instructors, a lot of what they are instructing is in the normal envelope and how to stay in the normal envelope. Teaching upset prevention and recovery training kicks in once you have left the normal envelope. And so much of that information becomes an entirely different skill set that they may not have been exposed to. So anyway, making sure that they have that motivation allows them to pass on their passion of the subject to the students, so that they realize the importance of this and really take it seriously. I'll pass it on from there.
Right, Mark.
So at the end of Randy's answer, he stole the word I was going to use, which is passion. Truthfully, what we found is we had both, as Randy pointed out, both military and civilian. In fact, we had very high-end military trained pilots and some civilian pilots that had never been over 60 degrees of bank that became some of our best instructors. In fact, we had a phenomenal team, and both sides informed the product that we ended up bringing to the line pilot and really made it an exceptional product. So the first is passion. The second is a belief in the importance of upset recovery and that it is not just another maneuver, right? That there's more depth to this, and the ability to transfer that in a foundational, fundamental way, not only to other instructors, but also students, and be able to pause and take a look at the data points and transfer that information so they can see, for example, if you step on the rudder, what the negative result is and why, and it ultimately builds on that. So passion, excellent instructor, and really ultimately the last piece is exceptional training. So that instructor needs the depth of training. We chose APS. We actually looked in the industry quite a bit. We looked at both homegrown programs with Alaska, which were excellent. We spoke with Delta as well to see how they had looked to manage the solution as well as just building our own. But ultimately, we chose APS like Delta, and really hand in hand helped us build that instructor in a exceptional way.
Thank you, Mark. Otter.
I don't really have much more to add to these great comments about the prerequisites of an instructor. I will just say, in addition to motivation and attitude and desire to be a UPRT instructor, which I thoroughly believe is key, I will say they need to have instructing experience, especially if they're going to do the practical training in the aircraft or the simulator. They need to have a good bedrock of instructing under their belt. I totally agree with the FAA when they say, hey, new CFIs, you've got to train for 2 years before you can train other instructors. So you would not want to put a new instructor into, I think, an on-aircraft or simulator UPRT instructor role. So there needs to be some minimum amount of time before they go into that role.
Yeah, that's a really good point, Otter. And I think what we find, which is kind of a seeming contradiction, is that you would think that it would take a lot longer to train an advanced simulator instructor, for example, on a 777. But in reality, the hardest person to train, or the hardest instructor to train, is the instructor that teaches on aircraft. And it takes many, many weeks, about 5 weeks, to train an instructor to teach on a simple on-aircraft platform to be sure that they are effective not only teaching it, but remaining safe and teaching transferable concepts. So, it really is a difficult challenge across the board. But to do it right, to have the paradigm shift, to be able to really mitigate this threat, it really takes quite a lot of training and a very different approach to it. So, Brian, over to you, sir.
Sure. Well, I think one of the decisions that Delta made early on that was really wise in the development of our UPRT program was that they selected instructors from a diverse background. So we had military instructors, we also had civilian instructors, and then those with a mixed background. And I think that was important for a couple reasons. One is each obviously has gaps in learning. Each brings strengths to the table of what they have experience flying and teaching themselves. But with a pilot group that was over 10,000 at that time and still is to this day, you have a really diverse group of pilots that you're trying to teach. And again, you'll see what they bring to the table, both good and bad. You may have a civilian pilot that has limited upset experience who may have issues with disorientation with the upsets. But then on the military side, you may have a pilot who has a lot of experience recovering aircraft from unusual attitudes or upsets, but they may be doing it in a way that is acceptable in a high-performance military aircraft, but not in a transport category aircraft. And this was something I noticed early on. A significant number of our pilots, particularly on the military side, will use rudder in recoveries. And one of the first guys I saw do that was a high-performance military jet instructor pilot. And using some of the instructor operating station tools that we have, I was able to see that he was using his feet in the recovery. And what was interesting was he had no recollection of doing that. So when we stopped, we put the sim on freeze, and I asked him, "What did you do in the recovery?" And then we went back and looked at the replay. He had put almost 70 pounds of pressure on his left foot with no recollection of doing that. And so it was a good opportunity to talk with that pilot about how to recover a transport category aircraft versus a military jet that he'd been flying. I think to move on to a couple of the other points in the slide that you have there, with a pilot group as large as ours is, where you're flying with potentially hundreds of different pilots each year, you need a standardized recovery strategy so that if and when something happens, everyone on the flight deck knows exactly what it is that they're going to do to recover that jet. And Brad, you mentioned it a couple times this morning, just sort of the fog of startle and the effect of startle and the human factors of that. That is tremendously important to communicate to our pilots, and we've seen that in some of the events that we've had online. One of the more significant events that we had several years ago, we went back and looked at the flight crew and thought, well, maybe they were new on the aircraft, maybe they were new to Delta, and they were not. They had, between the two pilots on the flight deck, tens of thousands of flight hours at Delta alone. And it wasn't something that they had done incorrectly, but it was something that was startling to them and took some time, longer than they anticipated, to recover that aircraft. And so really important to consider the fact that people of diverse backgrounds have diverse abilities to recover aircraft, but that the startle effect is the great equalizer. And if we don't have a standardized strategy where you are trained to implement it literally with seconds to spare, I think we're setting ourselves up for a problem. So with that, I'll pass it off to the next.
Great. Thank you, Brian. I think you bring up a couple really important points: an objective standard with the strategy and how it applies. And there's unique considerations for each fleet type, obviously. But the other part that I think you brought up that we didn't include in the slides is the value of the instructor operating station, especially a UPRT station that you can look at to determine what actually happened. Because to your point, very often the pilot flying does not remember what they did, and sometimes the instructor doesn't notice what's going on. So the replay mode is very valuable, or at least to look at a history of what had happened. Rich, over to you, sir.
Yes, thanks. All excellent points. And I'm going to illustrate the need for expert UPRT instructors with an example of how not to do it. And it's a topic that we've talked about before. Here in the States, at least, flight instructor applicants are required to undergo spin training and receive a flight instructor spin endorsement that says they have achieved instructional competency in spins, stalls and spins and spin recovery techniques. And so this kind of touches on all of the different boxes we have here, from the prerequisite experience on up to the program success measures. And unfortunately, what's happened, even though this is mandated for flight instructor applicants, there really is no qualification training. There are no standardized principles. It's just, this is what you have to do in a very broad sense. And unfortunately, what we find is the typical exposure is no to little academic discussion about spin dynamics, or stall dynamics for that matter, and very little practical experience with spins. Maybe 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 one-turn spin entries in one type of light general aviation airplane. And so in the end, this process, which is half of a UPRT experience, ends up being, unfortunately, really sad to say, a participation trophy. And we can measure the lack of success by the fact that these same spin certified instructors in the US continue to pass on their fear to the trainees, not all of them, but I would say a majority, poor technique in terms of spin recovery, and also just perpetuating the same mythology that we've been dealing with in terms of stall spin for almost 100 years now. So I'll leave it there. On to the next person.
Well said, Rich. Thank you so much. Nick, over to you.
Well, those are some really great points that have been made. And I like the last part about from Rich passing on their fear. And we know from our work that 1 or 2 flights with UPRT can actually sensitize a student to their perceived threat. So, in going back to looking at the prerequisites for a good UPRT instructor, I think that exposure experience is critical, because now we know that the instructor can operate in that environment, that he's adaptable to it. But as Brian was talking about, having the SA to where you can diagnose what the student is doing and help them along would only come from that higher level of situational awareness in the all attitude environment. But I cannot argue that having a humble and teaching heart is really the key. If you can tack that on with the all attitude, because we are teaching what is very counterintuitive to many, many pilots. And also, there's a lot of stress and uncertainty with a lot of students. So a good instructor to help them work through that will go a long way. And that's all I have.
Great. Thank you so much, Nick. So, gentlemen, I'm looking at the time here, and it looks like we may go a little long. So why don't we go around the room one more time and jump in on the topics of qualification training, standardization principles, or program success that you'd like to bring up. And then when we get through this round, we'll go to the questions. There are a few questions that we'll probably wrap it up just after an hour or so. So, Brad, why don't we go over to you? Was there anything you wanted to mention on those final 3 items? I know you have a great example of the A340 event that was a successful outcome, but that may be jumping to the end. So over to you and your thoughts to close up here before questions.
Thanks, PJ. I was just having a look at the FAA requirements for instructors giving UPRT and the ARSA requirements. And a few things there as far as the qualification training is concerned. If we look at one of the points, they say that the instructor should have a thorough understanding of the validated training envelope and the fidelity limitations of a simulator. Now, this is something that you can't just learn on a YouTube channel. You have to have an expert explaining to you what the VTE is firstly, what is the fidelity of a simulator, and then one has to be trained, as I think you mentioned it a bit earlier on, BJ, about the instructor operating station, having the tools to be able to monitor that kind of thing, because there's no point in training outside of the validated training envelope. Obviously, the airplane is not going to be behaving, the simulator is not going to be behaving the same way a real airplane is going to be behaving. So, that is very, very important in terms of qualification training. And then it also mentions that the instructor must be trained in disorientation and distraction. And how do you train an airline pilot who spends most of his time in a big jet flying or doing mostly simulator training? How do you train them in disorientation and distraction? We address this by sending our instructors on an on-aircraft training course, which is extremely important so that they can get the fundamentals of how to cope with disorientation and distraction. And I mean, that's one of the key things that he has to get across to the students in the simulator in terms of selling the philosophy of the strategy to them and having the students believe in the strategy and taking it up and making it part of their sort of makeup in terms of training is concerned. As far as the other subjects is concerned, I think Brian talked a lot about the standardization, having everybody teach the same thing. The way we addressed this is we obviously had a manual that the instructors almost had to learn verbatim, because if they used the wrong terminology, maybe through lack of experience, didn't understand the end result of using wrong terminology, we made sure that the guys were 100% standard in every little thing that they said right from the very beginning. And then that prevented a lot of the instructor drift that we foresee or saw as a possibility in the future. Obviously, once the guy starts seeing more and more of his students or training more and more of his students, he can adapt his program somewhat and bring in real life events and events that occur in the simulator to his training program. But standardization had to be 100% important right from the very beginning. And then as far as measuring the success of the program, I think if we look at two aspects there, the first is, do the students believe in the program? And over time, we've been running the program since 2014. Over time, the guys really adapted that strategy into their general aviation, into their way of thinking in terms of aviation decision making. They would use it in their briefings before takeoff. If there was a possibility of wind shear, they would bring the strategy into that. And so they were always familiar with the strategy. But one of the biggest measures of success was an incident that occurred in 2018 on our Airbus 340, where the guys suffered a severe overspeed event due to a 50-knot decrease in tailwind over the Swiss Alps at an altitude of 38,000 feet. And the aeroplane, they experienced an overspeed that they'd never seen before in a simulator. No simulator could simulate that kind of overspeed. The speed at that stage reached 0.89, and the trend vector went up to Mach 0.94. That resulted in severe startle. Then there was a cascade of events that took place where they misidentified a procedure, but nevertheless the aeroplane ended up in alternate law in a climb. The captain, it was his first solo flight on an Airbus on the long haul. He had been flying Boeing for many, many years. The crew, it was top of descent, so the crew were tired. They'd been in the air already for 11 or 12 hours, and they were suddenly thrown in this situation. The startle that they experienced, as the captain said, was a fear from the depth of his stomach. It was so startling that it really took him into a fight or flight mode where he couldn't actually function anymore. He didn't know what was going on. Although he had, in a way, caused the aeroplane to start climbing because of the fact that the maneuvering envelope got so confusing for them at that stage as they were climbing, and the aeroplane was pulling G because of the fact that it was trying to prevent an overspeed. The first time that he had a sense of being able to then be in control of the situation and overcome the startle was when he heard the stall warning going off, and the in-flight relief pilot actually started shouting the strategy, which is what they'd been trained to do. The minute that they heard the word upset recovery and of course the push word, which is part of the APS strategy, they felt a sense of, you know what, we can actually manage the situation now. We can revert to becoming a functioning pilot. And then obviously they recovered from a situation which was predicted to have had really catastrophic results. So I won't go too much into depth because I know that the other guys sometimes battle to put on some of the extra points there. So I'll hand it over to you guys.
Awesome. Great. Thank you so much, Brad. And we'll go over to you, Randy. And I just want to remind you in order that you had some videos. No need to use them if you don't want to. Totally up to you. But Randy, your closing thoughts here before we go to questions.
I'd like to advocate for a concept that I think ties together the qualification, standardization, and success themes, which is I know this is crazy, but what if we applied the same way of doing business, the same way of qualifying pilots to upset prevention recovery training that we do for other areas of training? So for instance, I have a CFI with an instrument add-on, multi-engine, and I can instruct in gliders. And if I combined all of those elements of training together, they do not require the amount of knowledge and skills that I apply, that I have to call on to teach upset prevention and recovery training. So how do we qualify instructors for those ratings? Well, we have standardized objective testing criteria. We have them study and we have them take a check ride. And we could do exactly that for a CFI UPRT or in other aspects of training, be it in simulator or aircraft, and let's think about where we started. This is not the second or third leading cause of fatalities. It's number one. And if that doesn't get our attention to try and change the way we are doing business, I don't know what will. Insanity is doing the same thing and expecting different results. Doing what I'm advocating could change the loss of control in flight rate that we have today. And I'll hand my soapbox off to the next person.
All right, great. Mark, go ahead, sir.
So the qualification specifically, I think you need to be sure to build a program that's robust enough that ensures that the instructors become experts. That's number one. And that's through the development, through simulator, if on aircraft training, and a deep level of understanding of the aspects. Standardization principles really come down to ensuring that, and I'm sure Brad and Brian in building their programs as well see this, making sure you have a robust QC program. So, and not only a QC program that then gives you feedback and evolves the program as you move forward and see where the threats are and how it's working, but also give the instructors and the line pilots tools like a briefing card. So, for example, at the beginning of a flight, we now have UPRT on the briefing card. So prior to each flight, we pull it out, we brief our whole flight, and at the very end, we say, in the event we encounter, and based on the conditions of that day, wind shear, we're going to be flying over mountains, or maybe even dynamically in the flight, we talk about, hey, there's been reports of mountain wave ahead. In the event we encounter, we will call that offset and go through the steps and process. That creates both a connection to the airplane, to the process, and as well as maintaining standardization. But that's for the line pilot. For the instructor, again, as we get that feedback, we ensure that there is constant maintenance of that product. And then we also give the instructors additional tools. We put together videos that the instructors can watch if they haven't taught it in a while, and things like that to maintain that piece. But program success, now I'm going to speak to something that Randy brought up early at the beginning. Even though I've been involved in this program in the process, I've moved out of the training center back to flying the line. And in fact, on my last flight, you never want to have to write reports, but I had the opportunity to because we were coming from Belize City into LA. It was night. Sun had just set. We were tracking behind American Airlines on I think it was the Hollywood arrival. And we were at 36,000 feet. They descended the American Airlines in front of us, which was a 787. I found out later it was approximately 8 miles ahead of us. They descended them to flight level 340 within about 3 or 4 minutes. We received the same descent. About that time, I called back and did a PA to the passengers. It was a beautiful, smooth night, clear. And I said, ladies and gentlemen, now would be a good time to get up and stretch your legs. I'll be turning on the fasten seatbelt sign in the next 10 minutes. And so as we leveled off of flight level 340, we encountered a shuddering turbulence. And then suddenly the airplane did a dramatic roll to the right. And immediately, and this is where we get into the last piece of this, and really, which is key, is the program success criteria, is seeing the results. Is the first officer, who was a relatively new first officer with the company, he and I called out in unison, upset, click, click. We got the auto throttle off, which oftentimes is a unique issue. Push. We did a light, gentle push because we were at high altitude. The airplane already has some roll. Because the autopilot was on initially, we got it off and we pushed it to a full roll. And then we called out, for us, is thrust, delta is power. We didn't really move the thrust much because we were cognitively thinking that we're at altitude. We don't want to reduce the thrust too much. And we did overbank to the left about 20 degrees, which I'll touch on in a minute, and stabilize. And we both had our flight path vectors up, and we smoothly stabilized back to our flight level. We advised ATC, etc. But the subtle piece of it is, and to Brad's point, which is really key, is that startle, is you don't know the results of your program until you see it happen in actuality, which you may never, or you may just see it through FSAT programs. But it was a beautiful example to see my first officer, who was actually the pilot flying, recover well. But what we also saw, to Brian's point, was he stepped on the rudder, and that's why we overshot to the left in debriefing that event. So it gives us both the opportunity to go back and relook at the threats in the program, and that it should continue both to evolve and be emphasized. Thank you.
Thank you so much for sharing that, Mark. Otter, over to you, sir.
Those are awesome stories and inputs. I will just say, those of you regulators out there, those of you airline training departments trying to figure out how to set up in your country or your airline, how to implement UPRT appropriately. IATA also has a great document, guidance material and best practices on UPRT. I would highly recommend it. One of the things they do say in there is they promote that you need to have some core instructors that are your subject matter experts on UPRT. And you should need to pour some good resources and training into those guys, because they're going to disseminate the appropriate training and information to the line pilots. And part of that is on aircraft training for your subject matter experts there. So definitely you need to get them that. In the airline level, even in the EASA world, there's no requirement for a simulator instructor to get on aircraft training, but it definitely is the best way for him to understand the human factors associated with upsets. Just talking about it academically, just talking about it in the simulator is challenging for an instructor to truly appreciate the challenging human factors at play in an upset.
Thanks, Otter. Brian.
Sure. So we've talked a lot about the standardization of the pilots. I'll touch briefly on the standardization of the instructors. On each of our fleets, we have 2 subject matter expert instructors who go to APS, go through on-aircraft training. They come back and then train our instructors, who in turn train our line pilots. And for the last several years, we've been trying to figure out what is the best way to control the drift. What is the best way to standardize the instructor training? And so what we've done at Delta to address that is each of the new instructors that come to the training department go through a standardized new instructor orientation course. One of those days is devoted entirely to upset prevention and recovery training. And that day must be taught only by one of the subject matter experts who has gone to APS, gone through the academic training, gone through the on-aircraft training, and then they teach every new instructor that comes to the training department. On our aircraft alone that I fly, the 75767, we're taking almost 45 new instructors onto that aircraft just in the next 4 months prior to the end of the year. All 45 of those have to be taught by either me or my fellow subject matter expert on that aircraft. And the hope is that when they get the information and the academic and the aircraft training directly from a subject matter expert, they will have the best quality control that we can, presenting that information to the line pilots. And then for our subject matter experts, we get evaluated as well, and we get trained as well. And so we go to APS for on-aircraft recurrent training, and I'm looking forward to Otter and BJ. I think you guys are coming to Delta here in the next few weeks to conduct subject matter expert recurrent training at Delta on our aircraft on each of the fleets that we train on. And so that's how we control the standardization here at Delta, is that we try to provide the information as close to the source as possible. And then the last thing I'll say on this is to Mark's point about the standardization and the success of the program. Yes, we see it in the FOQA data and we see it in the ASAP data, and we read the reviews of these incidents that happen and say, have we been successful? And I would say we have been very successful. The numbers have dropped significantly since we began this process. But the other piece that we don't spend much time talking about is the prevention aspect, is the upset prevention, recovery, and training. And I'll close with just a story from my last trip. I was coming back from overseas and was flying with another very experienced pilot. And I don't even think that I had mentioned to them at this point that I worked in upset prevention and recovery training. But one of the things that we have seen in our ASAP data was that on our fleet specifically, 75% of the stall warnings that occur at a very specific point in time, and that is between the flaps 1 and the flaps up selection, and it has to do with the angle of attack changing, the chord line of the wing changing. And so this pilot was the other pilot that I was flying with coming back from overseas, was the pilot flying on this particular leg, and he said, without me ever mentioning it to him, I'm going to delay the flap retraction on this departure because we have a speed restriction, and I don't want to get that close to maneuvering speed until we're basically rolled wings level and we're accelerating in normal flight. And I thought, man, what a win that this guy is already thinking ahead to that point and delaying the flap retraction to that point, knowing that that is a really high threat area on our aircraft. So I think the program has been successful. I hope that we continue to learn and grow and educate. And as new instructors come on board, we're going to have to continue the process. It's not a one and done solution. We have to continue training the new instructors and training the new thousands of pilots that are coming into commercial aviation every year.
Great. Thank you so much, Brian. I think it's a wonderful comment on the prevention side of it. And we do see that, an effective program does lay heavily on awareness and prevention, but there is tremendous value in the pilots having seen it escalate into a requirement for recovery to see those elements building and really intervene before they ever get there. And so it's a really important part of the process. All right, Rich, over to you, sir.
Yes, thanks, BJ. I have nothing to add to all of the great comments, so I'm ready for questions. I'll cede the rest of. I'll cede any of my time to who's next.
All right, wonderful. Okay, Nick, over to you, sir. You're on mute.
Super great points were all made. I think a lot of the good examples show that while it may not be easy, that a program, you can have a great program, and it takes a lot of work, but it is the number one threat. I'll close with that.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Nick. So I've been looking through the questions here, and I'm going to pull up just one, and it's from Jeff Wofford. Let me bring it onto the screen here. Let me see how it presents to everybody. Let me bring us back up to our group. And it really is a question that I think that we can just generally talk about, and I think it's fair. Jeff is actually the chairman of the MBAA Safety Committee, so it's a very appropriate question. He works largely in commercial corporate aviation, executive aviation, 135 on demand. But his question is this: what has the acceptance of the need for training been for 121 operators? In conversations I've had with corporate operators, the response is very mixed, ranging from don't need it to very interested and supportive to some that just want more information. So what is the general acceptance in the 121 of upset prevention recovery training? And this particular audience might be a little bit influenced by their implementation, but maybe just overall. Why don't we just go around the room, and it doesn't have to be any particular order, but let's just start with you, Brad, and we'll see how it plays from there.
We found the same issues. Some operators are very supportive, and I'm only talking about South Africa here. And others are sort of doing a bit of a box ticking exercise. The companies that are showing that are finding it important have done the right thing. They've sent the instructors to APS or consulted with subject matter experts to make sure that the training is done correctly. And then there are some other operators who obviously from a financial point of view don't have the money to do that. So it becomes more of a box ticking exercise for them. But very different to how the Part 135 operators see it as well, who tend to find that due to the costs of training, they also tend to sort of make it like a bit of a box ticking exercise in that regard.
Randy, thoughts?
Very quickly, I'd say that I've talked to a lot of airline pilots that don't see the need for UPRT. I've never talked to any of those airline instructors that I've worked with that at the culmination of training didn't agree that there was a lot of valuable material there. So it's just unfortunately a little bit of ignorance in industry at large that's keeping them from really getting on board UPRT and supporting it the way it probably should be.
Now, a question would be, do you think that's a function of the conundrum we presented at the beginning? Is that many of them see that it's just what they've been doing before under a new name, and they're not really seeing the new approach being implemented? They're not seeing the added value in some way. Over to you, Mark, and I'm not trying to set you up to answer in a certain way. What are your thoughts?
No, I thought so. Two parts. One, the operator or leadership. The other part is the line pilot. So when it comes to the economics of it, to manage a UPRT program, I think most of leadership looks at it from an economic point of view. The challenge with that is digging in and looking at the data, right? So we had a great opportunity when we laid out how the program should be run and put together. We were able to gather information from the industry, from APS, from other carriers, and present and also sell the benefits of UPRT and mitigating loss of control. And we got a certain level of buy-in. Now, understanding that, the question, the response is very mixed. We also saw that as well from leadership. Sometimes we saw, well, why do we need that? Why do we need verbalized call-outs? Why do we need this, that, and the other? And it took a lot of time based on backgrounds, right? Or personal experience, whether they're a single-seat fighter guy or a aerobatic guy. You get a lot of negative transfer where they would bring their own experiences to negatively impact their perceptions. But as soon as both our SMEs got training at APS, it gave us ammunition, right? And the ability to defend the benefits of having a program like this. And the company invested in it, which I really applaud United for the investment they made and the program we built. Now, saying that, continuing on, now that the program is done, it's really incredibly important. And to what Brian said is they're continuing to go down to APS. We're not. I would like to see that it's continued to be reemphasized and built and developed and evolved. So there is a threat there that there's a maintenance of the program, right? Whether that's internal or in relationship with partnership. Now the line pilot, I'm going to go there too. And I'll try not to take too much time, but we saw a range of response there as well. Both from other instructors that we were teaching in the line pilot that, well, the way I used to do it in my old airplane, well, the way I used to jump on the rudder in my fighter jet, which I mentioned before, or the way I managed it as an aerobatic pilot, there was again those threats that it took time to explain and understand. Here's the envelope we're going to stay in, here's the aircraft we're dealing with, and we wanted to build a good cross-fleet program which maintained that understanding, and then ultimately buy-in. And once we had that, we saw the results, but it took time. Next.
All right. Otter.
I'll just throw in, I've talked to a lot of airline pilots that frankly say something to the effect of, I don't think I need UPRT. Really don't. But I'll tell you, I have never talked to an airline pilot who went through a quality UPRT program and said, well, that was a waste of time. I have never talked to that. I'll leave it at that.
Well, I think, Otter, to your point, it's not uncommon for flight departments to send pilots who have that exact same feeling when they arrive to go through the program because their management made the decision for them, and they show up and they can become our very best champions at the end of the course. They knew they were on the other side of it. They didn't understand why they were showing up, but leaving saying, not only the most important training they've ever had, but they can't believe that they've been able to mitigate this threat almost by accident throughout their career. Okay, over to you, Brian. Thoughts on acceptance?
Well, BJ, I think you make a good point. Sometimes our toughest critics can be our biggest advocates, and that may, without telling the whole story, be how I ended up on this program because I was a bit of a critic, and 6 months later I was on the team teaching it. So, to Jeff's question, I think it would be a little bit more difficult in the corporate world to track the data just because you have so many various operators. But I will say that has been the number one key at Delta for buy-in, is that our pilots see the data. I can't share with you all of the data of the upsets, but I'll use some broad numbers that I will tell you are very, very conservative airline-wide, not just here, but at airlines around the world. Let's just assume for a second that a significant event happens once a month, and that's very conservative. Let's say a significant event happens once a month with an upset. Let's say you have 10,000 pilots in your pilot group. Your average pilot is not ever going to see that in a career. But once a month, one of your coworkers somewhere in the world is seeing that. And on that day, to that pilot and to those 200 passengers, it matters. And so to put it very, very bluntly, if we were putting 200 passengers in an accident once a month and putting that on every newspaper in the world or throughout the United States, change would occur. But that is how often these events are happening. And until our pilots saw that, and until they understood it, and until it was them, it didn't matter. But when they saw that, now they've adopted it. Now they've accepted it. They say, okay, I get it now. For our crew that I mentioned earlier that had over 20,000 hours on that aircraft at Delta Airlines, that had one of the most significant events we've ever had, they are absolute believers now, and probably some of the biggest advocates for getting other people to buy in. So we've had tremendous success with the buy-in, but they had to understand there was a threat before they understood we needed a solution.
Great, thank you, Brian. Rich, what are your thoughts on perspective, maybe from the GA perspective, on acceptance?
Yeah, so even though it's a GA perspective, I think it applies throughout the industry. First of all, we on this side of the UPRT things need to maintain control over the brand, right? So that it doesn't get co-opted and lumped in with the same old thing, just a different name. And of course, we are always fighting with whether it's new technologies or new programs like this, we're fighting institutional inertia, right, in a lot of different ways. And so part of it is building advocates, right? So you might have somebody who comes to you on their own and really sees a value in the program, and they become an advocate within the organization. And we've seen that even with government pilots, right? And so for more than 25 years now, we've been working with low-level government pilot communities, aviation communities, on emergency maneuver training and everything else, only because it's percolated from the bottom up. And so I think the other aspect too is if the concepts and the language and the benefits are incorporated right from the start with ab initio training, so that it's not something new, different, or something that that some other voice has gotten into their heads already and said, oh no, you don't want to do that. I think that can go a long way. So I think building the network of advocates will certainly help along the way.
Thank you, Rich. And I do want to talk about Rich just a little bit, because before we go, I do believe that he is the grandfather or the father or the generator of upset prevention, or the Santa Claus with the white beard there, of the originator of upset prevention recovery training, starting way back, Rich, and gosh, it must have been the early 90s that you started, maybe before that, on emergency maneuver training.
Yeah, 87.
Yeah, in 87. And then we saw airlines in the mid to late 90s with the upset recovery training aids. So, you know, it's just wonderful to see this approach, and it's starting to roll out. But I think your points are right on topic, Rich, is we have to keep it different. We have to fight the institutional inertia. It's a challenge. And I know that, you know, very often APS is viewed as zealots in the industry because we see how it can be done wrong, and we can see what it takes to save lives. And we're all about helping pilots bring everyone home safely. So saving lives is what it's all about. So we do draw a line in the sand sometimes. We do put our foot down, and that sometimes it hurts us a little bit. But you know what? At the end of the day, that one life or those 200 lives or thousands of life saves are going to be worth it. So Nick, over to you, sir, to wrap it up on this particular acceptance thought, because Nick has a unique perspective of working with the military day in, day out at our location in Dothan, Alabama. Nick, what are your thoughts?
Well, it's really hard to follow up on all the great comments that have been made. But I will say it is a challenge to change the hearts and minds. Like we said, from 49 on, nobody's done the spin training. We don't know what we don't know. And I've heard it said best that the greatest threat to any organization is entrenched success. So those who haven't had the exposure to an upset, they don't see the value. So it's an education process and a continuing one, and it's going to take a lot of work from these experts right here. Thank you.
Awesome. Great. Well, with that, I see there is a couple more questions. What I do believe they've been largely answered. So what I'm going to do now is I'm just going to post up. If you do have any questions, you can certainly reach out to us. We'll get on a call with you and chat about it. We would love to engage you in any way if you have any questions in any fashion on this particular topic or others. But I'd like to thank our speakers today. There's too many to go name by name, but thank you so much for your contribution. I will say there was a technical issue, unfortunately, on the main channel with LinkedIn. We got it going again, but we're going to post the entire video from the beginning into LinkedIn for those people that didn't see the whole transmission. But if you do want to see it immediately, go to YouTube, Facebook, or Twitter, and you can watch it right from the beginning. And I'd like to thank everybody who's on the channel with us today. We know there's going to be hundreds and probably thousands of pilots watching this. Please take the information seriously. Loss of control in flight is a major threat. Just doing what we used to do under a new name is not going to save lives, and we really need to be in this industry to save lives. So with that, I'd like to, again, just thank everybody, and we are going to head and close out, and everybody have a great day and be safe out there. Take care.